Well, hello everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. We have here with Reverend David Parry. He's in Valentine Hall. So let's all celebrate together this heartfelt holiday. It's not really a holiday because nobody gets any time off that I know of, but it's a holiday of the heart. It's where we can show our appreciation to our loved ones. So how you doing there, David?
Oh, well, I hope I'm clear, because actually I'm not in my new lodgings at the moment. I'm actually in a Valentine's hotel with my other half, and we're just about to open a bottle of rose champagne. So if I look odd, it's because no matter where I sit in this hotel room, there seems to be an arc lamp staring at me in some direction or other. But yes, I mean, it's a very special day for me, for us, because of course St. Valentine is the patron of our church. Some people think that Valentinianism was smuggled into some of the teachings of St. Valentine. I used to think no, but I'm not so sure now, because of some of the things he says about unity. You think, I've heard that somewhere before. But he's our patron, so it's our patronal in that sense, if I'm using a sort of Catholic or Anglican way of describing things. So it's a fine day for Valentine's Hall, a day for lovers across the world. And no matter, I hope everyone's got somebody to have a fine evening with. And if not, of course, you've got the Saviour, who is there for you always. How are you, John? How are you this week?
Well, actually, I'm doing good. As far as I could tell, I usually tend to respond. I don't know. They won't tell me. But I've been. I always have. It gives me something. This show gives me something to move forward, and I think that the whole key in pursuing a path, a spiritual path that we try to emphasize, is to have something that you're moving forward on. It's that forward motion. But a big part of that forward motion has to do with contextualizing things within the context of time. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about time and space, being and time. We discussed on our last show, and when he says being in time, it's interesting that, but he's speaking in terms of being current. And if you take a perspective on time to a larger dimension, then you enter into kind of the cosmological aspects of Rudolf Steiner's huge body of work. And an important part of what he tried to bring about was this cosmological perspective, this time beingness. And so that was the central approach in both of my books, is to provide a means for approaching time as a reality, and that's something that you could have a relationship with. And so whenever there's a festival, it's always pointing towards, or on most occasions, to some event that happened within the stream of time. And with David here, of course, being that he is one of his confessions is that he's a pastor of a Valentinian church, it's very apropos that we have this synchronized with our show today. And there's also Johann Valentin Andreas, and he was the author of The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, and also is thought to be, although there's contention as far as his part in the other two principal works of Rosicrucianism. But the chemical wedding of Christian Rosencreutz is part of a great tradition of Rosicrucianism that tries to contextualize using a kind of a legend or fairy tale or mythic dimension as a riddle. And as those of you that have been with us for some time know, that we continually are pursuing that elusive question mark, and that's what gives us a means to move forward, because there's always a riddle. We're not done yet, so we have to keep moving. Nothing to see here. Just keep moving. Is the way it's interpreted by the people that want to turn you into a space being and remove you from that litany of time in which we all are participants. But I thought today would be an interesting day to explore the mythos in time. And we're here with Reverend David, of course, and I have to dig into my pile here. And Reverend David is the author of 3 books. The Grammar of Witchcraft, which is a Shakespearean study. It's not a discourse on witchcraft. And then there's his Caliban's Redemption, his Shakespearean-esque poetry, and his masterwork, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by the talented Daniela Irendust. And this is quite critically acclaimed in the, what do we call them, the literati. And it's an interesting subject in dealing with Emanuel Swedenborg, who is one of the 3 principal figures that we keep grouping together in our conversations as far as being men of calculated to have the highest IQs of individuals in history. And being that Rudolf Steiner is perhaps, well, undoubtedly, but, according to other scholars, they might not agree with me, and that's okay. I like that. But that Rudolf Steiner is the principal representative in the 20th century of Goethean thought. That is, thought arising out of the work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Specifically, you could look at the Goetheanum, the Center for Anthroposophy in Dornach, Switzerland, that's named after Goethe. And as I've said before, Rudolf Steiner was the editor of Goethe's scientific works for the Kirchner edition of Goethe's works. And that in coming to terms with that, you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, really, it's that idea of being able to understand how one thing metamorphoses into another, and that is the real key to unlocking our relationship to the space-time continuum in which we live. But that to be able to come to terms with that, there's what is known in the Rosicrucian tradition as the world of duration. And by the world of duration, what they mean is to go beyond this three-dimensional world in which we're living and enter into the spiritual world in which it has a different meaning. Time has a different meaning. And if, for example, if one wants to come into contact with particular beings, the way to cultivate that is to contemplate the time periods in which they had a prominent role within, like, the archangelic periods, for example, that I frequently point to. Of course, our current regent, shall we say, is the Archangel Michael, who's working as a time spirit, and he represents that spirit of freedom that is so necessary for truly coming into what is called the Michaelic path to Christ. And Rudolf Steiner makes a distinction that's pretty subtle and that I thought would be an interesting touchstone, because he draws a distinction between the two words, I shall and I must, and that there's a great distinction. And I've had repeated requests from people who are listeners, our dear listeners, that I would touch on the idea of karma and how that plays into the Christian dispensation. And it's quite an interesting thing, because those two words give you a real key to understanding the deeper level of what that might mean, because that I shall means that you're doing it out of your own inner impulse of conscience, that still small voice of St. John. Whereas I must, it's like this dictate that's some kind of abstract, formulaic, legalistic way in which one would approach one's actions, which is really what we're all going through right now, is this whole external authoritarian urge that's coming out of the circles of the elite. They want to like lock it down, and they want to tell you what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and they try to put strictures on language and thought, and it's what can I say? They don't realize what the time in which we live, but yet there are those souls that I frequently make reference to that are bearing those forces of Ahrimanic beings that have been cast to earth in 1879 November, and that they now wish to work through the minds of human beings. And so you have these like spirits of materialism encroaching on humanity. But that materialism isn't all bad, in that we had to descend into materialism to be able to experience ourselves as being entirely separate from the spiritual world, so that we could redevelop our relationship to it and gain access to the spiritual world without losing our individuality. And so in my works, I outline that path. It's the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the true Rosicrucian Order, and the sequel, the Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative tool, and included in them is a very extensive series of, how do I lay that out there, get that in front, cosmological diagrams that I've mentioned many times. And the links are below on YouTube and on Facebook. If you want to find the books, you can go to Amazon for David's books. And for my books, you can go to eBay. I sell them through there. I don't sell them anywhere else. And but if you're outside the country, then you would have to contact me directly. You can contact me through the link that's provided below from my academia page, and that gives you contact information. Or you can contact me, a private message on Facebook. But getting into understanding this whole juxtaposition of I shall rather than I must is something I'd like to explore. So what do you think about that there, Reverend David?
Oh, I mean, excuse me, having done theology at university and the history of ideas, I tended to get sick of that sort of stuff, to be honest. I can understand it if it's in, so it's Steiner at his most philosophical, hooray, hooray, hooray. I can understand it if you're looking at what the burning bush actually said, because it seems to have said to Moses, I will be what I will be, as opposed to I am what I am. Now, that I can understand, because that's really important. But, oh God, splitting hairs, I used to get sick of it. At first, I thought how absolutely intriguing, until I came across a text by Alistair Crowley, of all people, not a good boy, who said something pompous about a curse on because. And I thought, oh, Lord, that's just because you don't want to admit actions have consequences. Yes, I like because. I like because you don't like because. So, no, I suppose, in strict philosophical circles, and I confess I dip into them sometimes, and sometimes I'm almost refreshed by doing that. It makes huge importance. It's part of the field, that they're part of the tools of the trade, but otherwise it makes me go sort of quite cold in so many ways. What's important in Christianity, the busy mother who has to put food on the table before hubby gets home and not scream and lose every shred of faith by the end of the week. That's what's important. The single mother, the people without homes, the starving, the dispossessed. I mean, that's what strikes me as generally important. And as I say, I do take those fine tunings of human thought seriously, but they don't command for me the space that they used to. Certainly in terms of time and space, I seem to remember a scripture somewhere that says eventually he will fold up time and space like a parchment. Well, by heavens, that seems unbelievably ahead of its time, because nobody thought those things could even be conceived of back in those days. So again, scripture proving to be prescient on all sorts of levels. In terms of Heidegger, I don't know. I rather like religious atheists. As I've said before on this show, my favorite one is Wittgenstein, the most religious atheist in human history, obsessed with purity. Oh, have I done the right thing? So I sort of like him a great deal. In terms of Heidegger, I don't know. Every time I see him dressed in a picture where he's a Swabian peasant, and trying to ponce around telling us he's leading this perfectly simple, idyllic life in the mountains. No, you're not. You're a professor of philosophy. You've got essays to mark. You've got a position to hold on to. No, that's called acting, and I know about that. And also, I love Martin Heidegger, but he's not my favorite sort of faithful atheist. He's not my favorite one. And I just seem to remember, I'm into Tillich. Now, that will get me into hot water. I think Paul Tillich is grossly misunderstood. I think Paul Tillich is one of the most important theologists ever to have lived, and certainly he's arguably the most important theologist in the 20th century. Of course, we're in the 21st century now. Who wrote extensively about Heidegger, who was saying things, well, is this existentialism? I mean, he takes you to a point where the existential surfaces, and then he just drops you there, although it means nothing. So, and of course, lots of people are having trouble nowadays connecting with Paul Tillich as a Christian existentialist. I'm not really sure why, because some people some people have told me he's too radical and he's trying to rewrite everything. That's not true. I mean, he was a major theologist at a major couple of seminaries, universities. He's got a different way of using language, and certainly he's got the existential taste. I mean, I do, but that doesn't mean that he's throwing out faith and he's throwing out truth and he's throwing out light. It certainly doesn't. What he's trying to do is see what those truths translate into in our time, and I believe that's incredibly important. No matter how wonderful the medievals were at explaining those truths to their time, that is their time, not our time. I mean, the ultimate Christian existentialist for me, I suppose, is Gabriel Marcel. I wrote a very, very tiny thing for him when I did my master's. I did my master's in pastoral theology at Heathrop, which has gone the way of old flesh, sadly. How about this? A university college that runs out of money and the rest of the university won't prop it up. because there's too much theology there. My God, what sort of academy are we living in now? So anyway, that aside, Gabriel Marcel, I don't know, he was a bit like me. I mean, he was a Catholic layman, obsessed with theatre. He wrote a couple of books on existentialism. He forced Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a friend of his, to actually admit there could be something like Christian existentialism, which Sartre, and I have a great admiration for Sartre. You know, I'm mindful of the story. I like all the unlikely people. As a pastor, I'm unusual because I like all those people I'm not meant to like. I mean, I also like Eugene Ionesco, the guy that started absurdism. And there are some wonderful things on YouTube. If our listeners want to go and have a sort of intellectual laugh, there's one point where he's in France, and because he's made it, he's so famous, you know, like everybody else, he's buggered off to France because it's so wonderful to live there. So he's there with the young French reporter. Oh, Monsieur Ionesco, you've had a very public row with Jean-Paul Sartre. What are you getting at? And he says, oh, Sartre. 1 minute he tells us he likes the Germans, but then they lose the war. And the next minute he tells us he's a communist. You know, so slap. So I rather like him. I rather like Jean-Paul Sartre because he actually stood up to Nazism, but that's another story. But you know, out of that milieu, you have Gabriel Marcel, who also has a hat in theatre, of course. For some people, didn't like his plays as much as they did his philosophy, which is a bit of a shame, because all he's really trying to do is put the same ideas into a stage performance. He's accused of being too preachy. I don't think that's true. I just don't think he gets much funding, or got much funding rather, to put the plays on, because they demand thought, and that's what most people don't want to do nowadays. But as a Catholic layman, he was saying these most extraordinary things that actually influence us in Valentine's Hall. Am I running a Valentinian church? The answer to that is no. Do we practice Valentinian Gnostic meditation? Yes, we do. Am I consecrated as also a Valentinian Gnostic priest? Yes, I am. But that doesn't mean it takes precedence or overrides my other ordinations, which I'm equally proud of. At the end of the day, I found Gnosticism / Valentinianism incredibly profound vehicles for depth meditation. They're methodologies. They're the machinery of going very deep. And some of the people that come to worship with us also share that view. You know, how deep can you go with Zen? Well, you can go to Buddha, all the way to Buddha. How deep can you go with Valentinian meditation? Some say all the way to the skirts of Christ himself, the robe of Christ himself. That is exciting. That not easy, and I suspect a very long-term project, but something worth working at. So yeah, I mean, I think Catholics are at their best when they're laymen, with love to all of my Catholic friends, and they're struggling with their faith, and they're coming out with these wonderful, you know, since I'm a layman, what does it all mean to me? So I understand his frustrations and his difficulties. Marcel seems to have had the same difficulties and angst that I do when I'm wearing my theatre cap. And certainly we look at him at Valentine's Hall, but we equally do practice, as I say, Gnostic meditation, because we find that of great help in our journey. But, you know, like anyone who's initiated into Zen, what you don't do is tell people this is what you will discover. I mean, one of my favorite Eastern, and you must have heard this, John, you know, favorite Eastern koans, aphorisms, is if you meet Buddha on the road, kill him. And, you know, like every other Westerner, you know, total shock horror when you first hear it, until you begin to think, oh, no, hang on, I know what that's about. You've got to find it yourself. You can't be told what it is. It's in your heart. It's in your conscience. It's in your mind. All you can do is use him as a guide, as a walking stick, but you can't ride on his back, because not only is that unfair on Gautama, it's unfair on you. So I think Valentinus was actually of that particular sort. You know, no, I'm not telling you what to think, but I am telling you a series of stories. I'm giving you a series of testimonies. I'm telling you what it was like to be a Christian in my time, in my space, in my world, and how we took a few steps beyond that. And that at Valentine's Hall is what we're trying to do if we manage to find enough rent, because I think the next service is our last one before we run out of rent. So we'll have to see what happens. Pray for us, everybody. And I'm handing back to you, John, on that doleful and worrying note.
Well, it's a challenging time for a great many people right now, myself included. It's like, but I guess that's why we're here, is to go through these challenges, but you have to be careful, because your I shall can be overwhelmed by your I must, and so there's that inexorable rule of karmic dispensation chasing you, the hounds, right? The almighty hound, and the hounds of God is hounds of heaven, as Francis Thompson. What a poet! Talk about a vocabulary. Geez, you almost think he was French. Anyways, we have to look at a couple of things here on the sidebar. First of all, dear Paula over in Amsterdam, she says these books are absolutely beautiful. Well, thank you so much. She just received copies of both of my books over in Amsterdam. What a marvelous place. And so that's excellent. I hope you enjoy them very much. And the wise old man, the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. Yeah, that's a nice thought. Oswald Spengler, that's obvious. I don't think that's his real name, but I'd love to talk to Oswald Spengler. He was an interesting character. The Decline of the West is like quite a work. In fact, Rudolf Steiner had said about Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, he said if people didn't accomplish certain things, it could end up becoming true. And I think that's maybe what we're looking at right now. But he wants me to ask you if you have any connections to York Minster Abbey.
Oh, before I answer that, when I did my first degree at King's College London, what miserable bastards they are. I hope they listen to this at some point. If you don't get into Oxford and Cambridge and there's anything left of the Church of England, you carve it up at King's College. Yeah, and prove I'm wrong. I'll see you outside, you lot. I spent 3 years in a bad mood only reading Oswald Spengler. I find that very difficult to believe. I seem to remember reading a few other books as well. I do confess I had a thing about Oswald Spengler. I do, because he even turns up in Mount Athos Inside Me, so that proves I've got a thing about him. What an incredibly astute man. I think the real bohemians, I mean, I'm going to get into hot water for this, John. I like reading Julius Evola. I know there are worrying associations with him. I'm perfectly aware of that. But just because I read a book, it doesn't mean I suddenly want to agree with everything the author says. What is wrong with people? How in Spengler's case, it was a masterful critique. In Evola's case, it worries me a bit. Although, of course, he did write a book entitled Why I'm Not a Fascist. So that has to be remembered as well. With all the accusations flowing around. I mean, there is a book there with that title to it. I don't know why that's asked. I've got friends. What, York Minster? Is our friend aiming at York Minster? I've got lots of friends in a couple of Yorkish establishments. I think your friend would need to be more explicit. I mean, remember, I'm Free Church, so like every other church, we have a state church in Britain. The church is the Church of England, cunningly disguised as the Church in Wales or the Church in Scotland. Hang on, you mean the Church of England, don't you? I mean, You know, the church in Ireland, oh my God, it's the Church of England again. So, of course, as a state church, they're part of government. Every church, every one of their churches is a government building. And they are paid state officials. That must be remembered. So, you know, there are a couple of, there are people in the House of Lords, which is an effective second chamber of our so-called democracy. I've been moaning about that all week. There's nothing democratic about our democracy. But, you know, these are people that must take position as arms of government. It's not a question. They are there to hold the rituals that crown the monarch, and they're also there to form a percentage of the feedback of the second chamber. Therefore, even the Catholics, even the hoary, ancient, and mystical Orthodox, we're all in the same bloody boat compared to the Church of England. You know, are you Church of England? No. Oh, would you mind going to the back of the queue then? And we'll get to you in a minute. You know, so yeah, I mean, like most other people, I've got very good friends at the Church of England, all that said, and I love Church of England ceremonies. But certainly, I have no official connection because I'm free church. And as I say, if you're not Church of England, you're just sort of a friend or an associate. You don't really have official connections unless you're asked onto one of these endless, pointless committees where basically the Church of England always wins the final vote at the end. So I'd have to know, you know, so 15 people raise their arms and the convener will say, oh, that's 3,000 votes. Then the Church of England guy raises his hand. Oh, and that's 70,000 votes. So we've won again. You know, so all this must stop. No, I'm humble little MCC Oasis. You know, I've got loads of friends, and the Church of England can be very profound and very deep and very healing. But it depends what your friend means. I'll go back into mute.
Yeah, he's making reference to a man who works at York Minster Metropolitan Church of St. Peter in York. So he wanted to know if you had any associations with that particular establishment. Yeah, well, there you go. The answer is yes. And yes is a good answer. That's very affirmative. Well, you know, getting into your thematic thing regarding the distinctions between shall and must. When you get into authoritarian, dogmatic, systemic religion, there you're getting into the must. You must do this, you must do that, and legally, so to speak. It's interesting because one of the great champions of the separation, pioneer in that type of thought, of the separation of church and state was Thomas Becket. And he really put his money where his mouth is on that one, by the way, in dealing with that whole theme of church and state and the separation. And even you can even go further. I was watching an interesting video this morning again, and it was Thomas Meyer, who's a Swiss anthroposophist who writes wonderful books. And in a conversation that he was having with Catherine Austin Fitts, who is she was at one time the deputy director of HUD, you know, the housing for the Bush administration back in the day. She has done some amazing work regarding missing funds in government and all kinds of things of that nature through her Solari report. And she's a financial consultant. But I'll go down that rabbit hole some other time because it's very fascinating. Because I wanted to get into what they were talking about in this video. They were talking about Chartres Cathedral. And Chartres Cathedral is very, very significant within the tradition itself. And outside of authoritarianism, you know, it's an interesting fact that the Chartres Cathedral has never been visited by a sitting pope ever, which is I think that they look upon that as kind of a symbolic badge of honor, so to speak. The tradition itself. One of my inspirations. Let's see if I have it over here. I pull books out because I think they might come up. Here's The Golden Age of Chartres, The Teachings of a Mystery School and the Divine Feminine by René Corrido. René Corrido was a student of Walter Johannes Stein, who wrote 9th century world history in the light of the Holy Grail. And he's kind of like, if you read my book, you want to read that one too, because I purposefully didn't deal with certain aspects of the Grail tradition because he had done such masterful work on that. That's Walter Johannes Stein. He was a mentor of one of my mentors, Werner Glass. And let's see here, what was I looking for? I get buried in books. That's what I am. But the School of Chartres is extremely important. And in getting into like the Cosmographia of Bernardus Silvestris, who was one of the teachers of Chartres. And see, the important thing to understand about Chartres is that they were custodians of the cosmological aspect of the Christ mystery. And that cosmological, astronomical, astrological mystery is very much tied into an understanding where in René Corrido's book, he makes reference to the eternal feminine, you see. And so there's the rose window, so famous at Chartres. And my books deal with that, the cosmological revelation of the Christ mystery, in attempting to give people a framework for their riddles, to be able to think through all the various themes that Rudolf Steiner addresses. But in getting back to Thomas Becket and his whole idea that he struggled with the king, who was his best buddy, by the way, but they argued back and forth as far as the autonomy of the church from the state. But a lot of people don't know this, but the secretary of Thomas Becket was John of Salisbury. He's like, he was between like the 1110s, and he passed in 1180 on 25th of October. But he liked to call himself Johannes Parvus, John the Little. But he was the bishop of Chartres at one time. And he's an Anglo-Saxon, though. He's not Norman, British. And so there's a certain humility of stature at that time, because the aristocracy, for the most part, and even still to this day, are of the Norman houses. But in the School of Chartres, they dealt with the 7 liberal arts and the idea, the plaint of nature, as it was expressed in that work of Alanus Abencelis, who Rudolf Steiner makes great note of, sometimes called Alan de Lille, or Alan of the Isles. He was an Irishman. But in the School of Chartres, you were able to receive this great, it was like a Platonic academy. And if you go to Chartres and you examine the artwork there, you'll see that there's representations of great figures in history that aren't even figures of the church, but that are historically significant. And one would go there and study, and they had a great library and great teachers there. There's a whole list of them. Sometime maybe we'll go more in depth. But because I'm trying to make the point of that, you would go there, and in the cathedrals, they were like books in stone, and which is really interesting because many of the people at that time were illiterate, your local people. But at Chartres Cathedral, you'll see that beneath various windows, works of art, and all that, it notates that that particular part of the church was financed by the bakers, and this one was by, clothiers, and this one was by farmers, and so the whole community had a share in Chartres Cathedral. And it's also interesting is that there is no cemetery at Chartres Cathedral, so it's more of a celebration of life than the birth death cycle than most places. But if you recall, those of you that read my book, Chartres Cathedral is amongst a series of cathedrals that are dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it's interesting because if you take a map out and you make a notation on the map of the location of these cathedrals, they form a star map of the constellation of the Great Bear. So I'll just give that as a little riddle for you to wrestle with, is why would that be? But Ursus Major. And so there's also the sacred wells that are present at the cathedrals. But in understanding that the teachings of Chartres was transitional from the ancient relation to tutelary spirits of the various arts, and to where it was becoming transformed through Aristotelianism from the Platonic archetypal image to the more abstract development, most specifically in the scholastic philosophy of Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. But it was understood that it was time for that. And you'll find that the stellar mysteries of the Grail converge there with the Arthurian and with the Northern mysteries, the Eastern mysteries of the Grail and the Southern mysteries. It's a point at which they come together. And in fact, there's even a certain connection in that spot to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a bearer of the Grail to Glastonbury. So it's a very important point. And it's interesting in that it has its kind of autonomy, because the whole idea of the Knights Templar that were sponsored by Bernard of Clairvaux, their impulse was to start in Jerusalem a Christian stream that was independent from Rome, from the Vatican. And here you have in Chartres Cathedral a church that's independent from Rome, and it's very much inspired by the tradition of Compostela in Spain and those mysteries that were carried on there that are also very, very important in the stream of the Grail. And in coming to terms with that cosmological theme in Rosicrucianism, Grail stream, it had to subside so that natural science could ascend in the materialistic impulses come forward to give us full separation from the world of spirit. And then now is the time to be able to reorient ourselves within this cosmological understanding, which can also be helped through the works of Valentinius, which are essentially cosmological, archetypal. I see them as, I equate them kind of like they're the Christian version of like Tibetan Buddhism, where they have this whole process psychology. And so in that sense, they're more akin to Carl Jung. It's this whole idea of archetypal processing through archetypes, which is very much akin to the Platonic school of Chartres.
Gosh, I mean, where do I begin with all of that? Who's that conspiracy theorist? They call him Rusty. I can't remember his name offhand. Rusty. He was on a show with David Icke a couple of years ago, old Icke. And Rusty was taken to Rome at one point, and he said, "Oh my God, there's occultism everywhere." And I wanted to shout at him, "It's called culture. It's called culture, you uneducated bugger. It's called culture." No, things like that irritate me no end. There is nothing. If you're anti-culture, then join in with the cancel culture group because you're the same sort of person. By the way, human beings make culture to improve their environment. That is what they do, and understand it more. I wish I was a space being. You've got me thinking about that. What were all those wonderful sci-fi films years back when people still had faith in the future? I still got faith in the future, where you'd see people floating around, space stations, and all the aliens would turn up. Then we'd give them a good biffing, and everything would be okay again. Why can't all that come back? That's wonderful. In terms of Valentinus, I think you've actually hit something there very profound. Before I get to that, let me go to something you said a minute ago. I wasn't as aware as I am now of the distinction between spirit or consciousness or the vital principle of matter as I was until I read a novel. Yes, it's a novel called Le Baphomet by Pierre Klosowski, who is an artist and a very, very serious metaphysical writer who talks about the return of Sir Jacques de Molay and his Templars into our time, but they've all been in eternity and they can't quite work out which thought belongs to which spirit, what life experience belongs to who. And you suddenly realize as this wonderful novel unfolds, there's a sort of Aristotelian underpinning that we need the material world, we need the flesh, we need that frame of experience if we're ever to make sense of higher worlds. And that for me was an opening of real perception, which fortified me curiously for that time when I came into an encounter with the Valentinians. Remember, my stream of Valentinian contacts is in Italy, it's not in France. There are Valentinians in France. As I've said before, and this is no insult to anybody, I think the world of Gnosticism on the continent, that's me being a total ignorant Brit and talking about the continent, but I've always liked that. Yes, I'm going to the continent for the weekend. That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? We're going to where the grown-ups live for the weekend. So yeah, I mean, I think it's very complex, and I think some of the streams of Gnosticism in France leave me very worried, if I'm completely honest. We've been on this in the show before onto sort of Christian Gnosticism, which there clearly is, and yes, I'll argue with anybody that thinks there isn't, because it's very, very clear. All the documents are in place, and very manifestly non-Christian forms of Gnosticism. And I'm not saying they should be stamped out, but they're not the same thing at all. And I don't know, with my dealings with my French confrères, I was always left with a feeling of not quite knowing where I stood. That's because they're bloody Frenchies, of course. But they had some very profound things to say, and they had some wonderful things to say. But I ended up thinking, oh my God, I don't. Is that Christian at all? So when I got to the Italian stream, it very clearly was. And it reminded me of when I got involved in it of either Kala Chakra, the sort of Mongolian mystery school of Buddhism, or the very high Mahayana. I mean, they're all meant to be Theravadan, but they're not. The very high mystical parts of Tibetan Buddhism, where there's a mudra, in other words, there's a movement, there's a color, there's a sound, there's a smell, there's a number, there's a star, there's a plant, all of which is associated with a particular mandala, a part of a mandala, a figure in a mandala. So I felt very, very much at home, curiously, when I started looking at Valentinianism more seriously. And yeah, I think Jung was obsessed with it at one point. I mean, he moved on to alchemy. It's difficult not to move on to alchemy. But, I think his works on Gnosticism are clear and profound, and really need revisiting, because I think the alchemical stuff, if you want to live as an alchemist, it's great. But if you're already a member of the grand Christian tradition, there isn't really a need, because what you're doing is doubling up the research. It was something that Falconelli said, what is alchemy? It's a fire. The religious believer has the fire through the mass, through communion, through the meal of remembrance. But if you're not a believer, alchemy is the fire. And I always thought there was something really true in that. There was something really profound in that. If you cannot rise to the mysteries of faith, and that takes a lot of work, particularly in our modern times, then maybe there are other ways that you can do that. And certainly, you know, the 100,000 arms of the ever-saving Christ are reaching out to everybody all the time. I think that needs to be remembered. I don't know what you think about that, John, but certainly I'd agree. And I think, you know, maybe we need a show about Valentinianism. Oh, I just finish off my bit by saying the York thing. Yes, I know some people up there. I've no official connection. But, you know, I know lots of people in lots of places and there's no official connection. I mean, that's showbiz, as they say, you know, that's modern church life. It doesn't actually mean anything. Anyway, I'm handing back to you.
Yeah, well, getting back to this whole idea of being able to bring oneself into a time relationship, Rudolf Steiner made the point in a lecture he gave in Dornach on October 3rd in 1914. And he said, in the physical world, if we want to see something, we must go to it. Those who want to see Rome must go to Rome. That is quite natural in the physical world, for Rome will not come to them. In the spiritual world, it is just the reverse. We could do nothing except prepare ourselves through the methods described in order to be worthy to receive the spiritual world. We must acquire restfulness of soul, poise where we stand. Then the spiritual world comes to us. We must wait for it in restfulness of soul. That is the essential. And so that's a really kind of a reversal of the views of quite a few people that like to philosophize about the path itself. Julius Evola, okay, he's a good example because he's like into this, like, I'm going to, you know, crash through with my will, you know, and he never quite understood, and you get that interesting tendency. That's that Luciferic arrogance, you see, that asserts itself as the will to power. So it's because the Lucifer Ahriman teeter-totter that rocks you back and forth in the lullaby of worldly logic, so to speak. And so you get caught up into this arrogant struggle for power. And that's a lot of what I see with Julius Evola, although I enjoyed reading him because he's capable of expressing himself in clear concepts. You know, he shares that with other writers within the traditionalists that I enjoy also, although I find them a little tendency to be a little uncompromising. I remember I set up a friend of mine who ended up becoming a leading traditionalist publisher, but at the beginning of his journey in traditionalism, I set him up with William Stoddard, who lives in Windsor, across the river from Detroit, and William Stoddard is one of their circle. And when he went to meet with him, he started mentioning various, because this guy was he was actually born within 24 hours of me. He was born like the day before me, less than 24 hours, and we looked like brothers. Even we look more like brothers than I look like with my actual brothers. But he's a wonderful soul. And but he met with William Stoddard, and he realized that if he's going to talk to traditionalist authors, he can't mention Rudolf Steiner or Madame Blavatsky. They just shut down, or Carl Jung for that matter. they just shut right down. It's like they think you just disqualified yourself, which is really, really interesting, because if you go and you read Rene Guénon, who's the leading guy in that whole thing, you go, this just sounds like really kind of tightly wound analytical stuff that if he studied a little bit of Steiner, he could gain more fluidity in his thinking. It's like they tend to when people approach philosophical basis and they get into that whole concept of the eternal now concept, the Advaita Vedanta, you got to remember that the exponents of Advaita Vedanta, or for that matter, Kashmir Shivaitism, were not saying that there wasn't this time, loom of time. And that's the kind of the churning of the sea of milk, right? With the devas and the asuras that is depicted in the temple in Southeast Asia. That there's that whole idea, but what is that churning that's going on? But the vortices that as C.G. Harrison so eloquently states, that everything arises through vortical activity, that everything arises through vortex. And Rudolf Steiner really makes the point where he just flat out at one point says that it's a total illusion, the material. It's a result of misinterpreting the counterposed vortical activity. He didn't say that. I'm just paraphrasing because I don't have time here to look up the actual reference, but I will at some point. But so in understanding that vortexing, that's been very central in my personal path. In fact, that played a big role in the heart research that I was involved with through Ralph Marinelli, who was one of the directors of the Waldorf Institute of Teacher Training and the Steiner Training Institute here in near Detroit, and where we were able to prove, and an article ended up being published, although I wasn't included as an author because I don't have a diploma to back up my opinion, but I was his editor. We prepared the work. Someday I'll publish stuff from that. It'd be a good idea. But it ended up getting published, and we proved that the heart is not a pump. And Rudolf Steiner said that that was a real critical understanding that had to come into the world to redeem the world from this intense martial approach to life, and to be able to enter into that whole concept where one views this as a cosmos of love. And so that's the mission of Valentine's Day, is the cosmos of love. And so going back to the Steiner quote, he says that it's just the reverse. Instead of going to it, you're getting it to come to you. Because the context of this statement is that he talks about the fish in the cave in Kentucky that somewhere in the distant past wandered into this cave where there's no sunlight, and now they're blind. Their eyes are no longer, even if were they exposed to light, they couldn't see. And so that Goethe says the eye was created by light to receive light. And so it's true with all of our senses. Our senses are a response to something objective, and it's the same way in supersensible development. And so if you want to develop yourself towards higher levels of being, multiple states of being, as Rene Guénon describes it, it's getting them to pay attention to you. And the way you do that is by preparing yourself. It's like preparing yourself for a guest, is the way Ram Dass said to us one time. We used to do poetry readings to help raise money for his charity. And that's a good way of looking at it, because really that's what you are, because it's through them realizing that you're at a point to where you're ready for them, they come to you. And that's why true Rosicrucianism, there's no membership fees. They don't have a clubhouse. There's a lot of Rosicrucian organizations, and I'm not disparaging any of them, but the true Rosicrucian Brotherhood is, when you get ready, when you're at that point, they will come to you. They'll find you. Don't worry. They know, and it's likewise with the angels and the archangels and all the spiritual beings, is that you develop the capacity to function within their realm by attracting their attention. It builds in you the capacity to function in that realm. And in being able to work in the waters between I shall and I must. Rudolf Steiner talks about how the future evolution of mankind is to evolve into the angelic realm. But there is a group of beings coming in behind us who, when we're angels, they're going to be the equivalent of fourth stage being, a human thing. And that the quality of our being is what determines the quality of their being. That we're in essence creating the future world through our activity. And so that's the philosophical underpinning of the concepts of morality within spiritual science, is that we have to have a conscientiousness that we're involved in this process. It's very sacred, it's very serious, but don't lose your sense of humor. And so that's that. If we can evolve to where we're taking up the challenge of I shall, that is a higher destiny than I must, then we're helping develop towards that stream of time.
Oh, a couple of things to say there. First of all, please don't take it the wrong way yourself, John, or our listeners. Yes, I do keep yawning, because I made the mistake of having a wonderfully relaxing lavender bath. It's bloody Valentine's Day before coming on air, so I feel totally bloody relaxed at the minute, and I'm struggling to get energy back for this wonderful show, which is one of the high points of my week too. So you know that, John. I look forward to this very, very much. Secondly, I seem to be on the set for Poltergeist. Have you noticed? All of a sudden, there are these sudden luminosities behind me. The light goes up and the light suddenly dims, so God knows what's going on there. There was one thing, oh no, I hate it. I'm trying so hard to get into it, but I hate it. I read David Hume as an undergraduate. If ever there was an organic intellectual, a la Antonio Gramsci, it's you. Diplomas are only important if you're trying to make headway in a profession. I don't buy into this modern nonsense that somehow it legitimates you in life generally. Bloody grow up. Who on earth ever said that? So as someone aiming at pastoring, I needed certain diplomas. That doesn't mean John isn't a consummate I'll tell you about a story, actually. A consummate organic intellectual in the best sense of the word. You are. I flirted with Euro-communism. I lasted 3 days. I flirted with Euro-communism when I was a young cub. I'd suddenly discovered Antonio Gramsci, and then I realized he was a dwarf. And I thought, oh my God, those huge books were written by a dwarf. So I read the prison notebooks, and I went to a meeting of Euro-communists. It was extraordinary. It was one of these buildings near the University of London Senate House. So, bloody students left, all drunk, by the way, left, right and centre. And there was some old actor who was Antonio Gramsci, staggering, because of course he was some sort of cripple as well as a drunk, staggering to the stage and giving this wonderful speech that went on for about 15 minutes. I thought, oh my God, that's wonderful. And then the whole day turned into a row. Every single room was everybody rowing. Beatrice Campbell was a Labour MP who turned up. She tried to open her mouth before she got too far, somebody shouted from the back, "We haven't forgotten the working class, B." And then that room exploded as well. And I thought, walking around every room, you couldn't get a word in. You sat down. You know, this is the room where they're talking about dialectical materialism, and you went in, and I'm sorry, but you don't understand what the working class is going through at the minute. So I went through every room, and I couldn't stand anymore, and I left. I left after about an hour and a half, and that was the end of my flirtation with Euro-communism. You know, if you're looking for a row, you've gone to the right place. But my God, there must be more to life than having a row about nothing in particular. And they all went down the pub afterwards, from what I heard, and had a drink. Well, that's so much for your principles then. So, comrade, have another pint and just get over it. You know. So no, I mean, as a short, you got me thinking on all sorts of lines today. I've never been to Chartres. I think I'm talking my other half into that the minute we finish this program. I went to Notre Dame. You know, short puff pasta meets Notre Dame. Short puff pasta into art meets Notre Dame. I nearly swooned at the doorway, which was spectacular beyond belief. Could hardly drag myself through the doorway before being hit by various states of aesthetic paralysis. Oh my God, that architecture. Oh my God, that stained glass is just so perfect. And apparently this went on for the entire day with me irritating the people I was with. But, you know, how anyone can't notice the esotericism in buildings like that, which, as you said earlier, John, they're living books. They're not simply... I mean, a lot of people were illiterate in those days. A lot of people are illiterate bloody nowadays. You know, you can't beat the fact that that was a living book, not just a replacement for text. I think it was Victor Hugo that said the medieval cathedrals were the way they were because books hadn't come along yet. Well, that's a bit churlish. I mean, you know, were your sales down for the week or something? You know, and you're a great writer. You know, don't be like that. Don't be like that. Because obviously they were doing so much more. You know, the sense of space, the sense of colour, the engineered atmospheres. Different parts of the building had different sensations, and that was created. It was manufactured to give you highs and lows and openings into all of these different states of consciousness. It was, I barely made it out of Notre Dame alive, having been overcome by its beauty. Of course, no one can do that now because, you know, a couple of years ago it burnt down. They say through some sort of electrical wiring problem. Yeah, I mean, stuff like that can happen. I hope that's what it was. No, I don't believe it can be rebuilt, even if they follow all of those things perfectly, because you'd lose the angels of time that gave it its hallowed nature and that had created those doorways, those stargates of perception, which I don't believe can be recreated. I think, you know, that for me is why I don't believe in external hierarchies. It doesn't surprise me that the papacy has a very disgruntled attitude to such unrelenting beauty. And, you know, it's something that can't be controlled. The thoughts it produces, the sensations these places are trying to engineer in their visitors, the sheer feeling of elation, which then goes along with the teaching. I mean, to go on about one bit more about Notre Dame, I suddenly corked onto the fact that one of the rows of heraldic symbols was actually an alchemical process. I had to walk back about 15 times to the beginning because it began with a varlet, a mere working class nobody, opening a secret vial of something and pouring a single droplet into a bowl, and it took me ages to work out what was going on there. I thought, oh my God, he's meant to be an alchemist. So I went up and down this bit for apparently a couple of hours, boring everybody else to death. But I'm sorry, it was worth it. Yeah. Didn't work out what he was getting at, but I knew it was important. It was beautifully done. No, Chartres and those people, you know, those places need to be regarded as cultural universal treasures of the human race, of humankind, because they're doing something unique that's open to everybody. I know some people, my brothers and sisters in the church, find that uncomfortable. I think at the end of the day, you must embrace Christ. You must. There's no way around that. That is the only way to truth and life. But that doesn't mean there aren't lots of spheres and avenues and dimensions along the way. And in my house, in my father's house, there are many mansions, and it's very unwise and insulting to the Holy Spirit to push that to one side. Just because you've gone through your checklist in your Southern Baptist church doesn't necessarily mean that you've reached nirvana. And maybe there are other ways of doing it too. Don't be so selfish and don't be so rude. Oh gosh, no, I'll pass it back to you, John, because I'm thinking of all these Notre Dame stories at the minute. One last thing. Yeah, I mean, perhaps with the Julius Evolas of the world and the Genons of the world, maybe they're the true bohemians. I was thinking that the other day. I was talking to a friend of mine, Vladimir Wiedemann. He's come up on the show before. Who are the real bohemians? The people that actually don't fit in much anywhere, but they're still worth a read. And then you just think, did I agree with that bit? Didn't I agree with that bit? I suspect they're hiding in plain sight, and it would do us all a great deal of good to look at them. Oh, right, there's one more story, then I'll hand back. An apocryphal story. The founder of modern British Wicca, Gerald Gardner, is in the letters somewhere, I can't remember where, took some Etruscan plates to go and see Julius Evola to see if he agreed they were witchcraft or not. And all Evola does is go on and on and on about the puffy handbag he had. So, it's a clash of British and Italian culture, the aristocratic Evola, because he said he brought the Etruscan plates in a string handbag, in a string carrier, like women do when they're doing their shopping for vegetables in an Italian supermarket. And he just goes on and on and on about Gerald Gardner's puffy handbag. And then about Gerald Gardner, I mean, he said to Gerald, yes, look, it's probably something to do with witchcraft. And I mean, Gerald shouldn't be underrated. He was an eccentric English guy, very, very interesting in his own right, who felt vindicated and didn't realize what the writer was going to venomously put down the minute he'd left the room. So, yeah, I mean, we need to remember, I don't know, traditionalism. I like radical traditionalism. Some people have called me that. I don't know. I like the radical bit. Am I happy with the traditional bit? I don't know. My trouble with most traditionalists is they can't embrace the radical. But tradition is tradition. There are other avenues of thought as well. And if with most radical traditionalists, they forget the radical bit. So, right, one last thing. Sorry. Colin Wilson. I never got to meet him. I had friends in common with him. What a prolific author. The Outsider, of course, deserved to be an international bestseller. I hated his book on occultism. What was it? Oh, you can remember this better than me, John. What was it? Mysticism or the occult or something? Just shut up, man. 3 chapters on saying why he's right about everything. Shut up. If you were that certain, you wouldn't need 3 chapters to tell us all you're right about everything. But, an extremely gifted man who I think embodies the radical traditionalist spirit, because he's saying there is great depth to our European traditions, which we simply cannot ignore, very similar to Rudolf Steiner. But, let's not also forget the impetus of the new, the power of what's coming next, because that's equally exciting. So maybe we can have a talk about him at some point, because I had friends in common, sadly never got to bump. I'd have really loved that. But apparently he lived his life as nearly a hermit. 100 books, for God's sake. Did he have time to eat? But, he managed to do it. And yeah, I think that's worth looking at too. So radical traditionalism, thumbs up from Reverend David.
Yeah, Colin Wilson's an interesting figure in that it's frequently the case that somebody broaches into a subject and then only to find somebody's throwing a quote regarding that from Colin Wilson. And given that he's got like 100 books or something like that, it's like I don't know anybody that's fully conversant in Colin Wilson, and it's too recent to be found on any of the free archives. So good luck. But yeah, his book Outsider is very interesting. There's also Robert Anton Wilson, the other Wilson. And there's Mr. Wilson, who lived next door to Dennis the Menace, too. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, who's like the ultimate symbol of what's wrong with America. But getting into what you were saying about the real bohemians, that, I mean, that really goes back. I mean, if you go back to your heroes for 3 days, back when you were flirting with the communist worldview, Marx and Engels and their manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, they're co-authors. But a lot of the people that think they're communists and are championing them, I look at them the way I look at people who are people of color that champion Che Guevara, because Che Guevara was a total racist. He liked nothing better than just taking out people that weren't of the right racial background. He was a total fanatic about that. And Marx and Engels, they actually even created a special term for those that they considered to be beneath contempt. They called them the lumpen proletariat. Okay, and basically, that's 19th century German political lingo that they created to encapsulate their views of what they consider to be the dangerous class, or the social scum, the underclass, the ragamuffins, the riffraff. And because it means like a ragged proletariat, actually literally it was their term for the working class. And here's a quote, just in case people think that Marx is some kind of hero for the under guy. Here's what he thinks about the under guy, just so you know. In his the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon from 1852, he says, alongside ruined ruse with questionable means of support and dubious origin, degenerate and adventurous scons of the bourgeoisie, there were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged convicts, runaway galley slaves, swindlers, charlatans, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, procurers, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the entirely undefined, disintegrating mass thrown together in Yan, which the French call la bohème. So there you have his view of no doubt all these people that are running around saying they're communists, and that's your champion, the guy that hates you. So just so you know, I mean, we're trying to get to truth here. Let's be realistic about this. And in fact, Karl Marx himself, he disavowed the communist idea toward the end of his life himself, personally. He realized it was just an exercise in abstract thinking, basically, because he started to realize that human nature doesn't have it in them to be able to pull that one off. Not yet. Not until the 6th period. We're only in the 5th period. We're too selfish now. And so that we have to ultimately evolve ourselves, and so that it'll be an act of I shall rather than I must. Because see, the whole communist system thing is you must do this, you must do that. It's this whole authoritarian structuralist thing. Whereas in the future, that communitarian, the communion of Christ, that's that I shall. You're coming out of freedom, caring more for your brother than for yourself. And so in that spirit, that's what Aaron from Pfeiffer, he described it as Johannine Christianity. And that's the quiet, secret school of Christianity. And that's of which the Rosicrucian stream is a branch. And he said to attune oneself to this stream, try to do something every day for someone that you don't know, where you don't get anything out of it. It's just a way of getting beyond self-love and being able to have a larger circle in which that love expresses itself, because as it says in the Gospel of John, God is love. And mind you, that Riddlestein is very clear when he says that in the beginning was the Word was with God. He says, by saying that logos in that expression, they mean word. It's not a bunch of abstract concepts, but that there was, if you go into Genesis, where God breathed life into man, and Rudolf Steiner brings up the whole idea of looking at the steam that are in cold weather that arises from one's breath, and that there's a kind of an astral etheric aspect to that, and that's what you're giving forth, and what's the quality of your being, so that your exhalations are either contributing something beneficial to the world, or are you, through your negativity, just crashing it down around your ears, so that and there's deeper levels that perhaps we'll get into someday in trying to articulate that further. But we're building towards the future story and development of evolution, to where what Rudolf Steiner describes as the Jupiter evolution. That's after the Earth, the moon is returned to the Earth, and the Earth is no longer here. We go into a pralaya, a period of rest, and then the next globe arises out of the pralaya. And that is that whole thematic understanding of the seven mysteries that I explore in my books. So we're getting close to the end here. And I do want to give you an opportunity to, by Reverend David and I, contribute towards our efforts here. And so to do that, you can go to paypal.me/John Barnwell 888 for myself, or for Reverend David, that's paypal.me/D Parry 777. That's DPARRY 777. And I appreciate the people that have contributed up to this point. It's very humble contribution that's made a difference in my life, I know. And for those of you that want my books or David's books, of course, the links are below. And but as we cruise to the end of our dialogue, the conversation, it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner had once said that regarding conversations about such subject matter, he was very cautionary. He says, well, having conversations about this, you're just going to make people angry. And it's annoying to some people that, a lot of those people, well, they started listening and they shut off a long time ago, I'm sure, because that's the good thing about this. People can just go and nobody even knows they left. So there's a certain beauty of anonymity going on here. But that being said, yeah, there's people that are very defensive of their abstract view of the world, or that they have the answer, they understand the way things are, even though in light of spiritual science, that's basically described as a childish illusion. But I don't mean that with any arrogance. It's just that how could a worldview that doesn't include the spiritual world and all the various facets of it, could that be, I mean, there's only a brief period in history where anybody had a view like that. That's just basically in the last few hundred years that people have devolved into thinking that the world is just a material phenomenon, and that life arose out of a swamp. Well, I think that government arose out of a swamp. That's true, but not evolution. And so there's this argument between the creationists and the evolutionary theory. And it's interesting because they argue with each other, and for the most part, they're not even aware of the third, which is that the evolutionary creation thematic presentation of the secret doctrine of Rudolf Steiner and of C.G. Harrison, that whole idea, the Goethean concept of the metamorphosis of worlds, that's embraced by ancient cultures universally if you know how to decipher it. So that being said, when we get toward the end, we always have a tendency to, in fact, we always have, to ask David if he would kind of consecrate our endeavor with one of his prayers. Of course, he likes to get in the last word beforehand, and that's a good thing too. So then there you have it.
Well, I hope you don't think it's me getting in the last word. Oh God, a couple of things that said. I've always had the attitude. Robert Browning, what a wonderful British poet. When he was doing his character studies, I always resonated with Kashish, the picker up of learning's crumbs, who didn't know what it all meant, but one day under Almighty Allah, things would make glorious sense. I think that's what you and I are doing on this show, and I think that's a golden heritage there. Che Guevara, you know nothing about gay history if you like Che Guevara. What a total bastard. You know, throwing LGBT people into jail and executing them for no reason at all. So no, don't. Oh God, there's a show. Thirdly, I was reminded that Karl Marx said towards the end of his life, I can't remember in which book it was, thank God I'm not a Marxist. I will try and come up with which book that's in, because you're from the horse's mouth. Anyway, my dear friend John, listeners, this is a Saint's Day. Every day is a Saint's Day, but maybe this is a very special Saint's Day because through the joys of relationships with our kith and our kin and our special other half, we remember not only the bonds that make us more human, we remember our basic humanity and the need to share love, but also that great aspiration to unconditional love, which stands above us all and waits for that glorious day when it too, when the Spirit itself will marvel in our works before the Almighty. Faith alone saves us, but that doesn't mean we mustn't step up to the mark and do what's right. May St. Valentine bless you all this day and always, and may his light shine in every relationship that you have in your life. God bless you all.
Amen. Well, thank you once again for another wonderful Sunday. And 17 degrees here, and that's okay. You can see your breath.